Welcome to KnotWork Storytelling. This is the show where we untangle our myths and reweave our stories, one age-old tale at a time. I'm your host and lead storyteller, Marisa Gowdy. I'm a myth worker, a story healer, a coach for writers and creative entrepreneurs, and the author of The Sovereignty Knot, A Woman's Way to Freedom, Power, Love, and Magic. If you love what you hear and want to support the show, I'd be so grateful if you'd become a paid subscriber on Substack. In my newsletter, Myth is Medicine, you'll receive bonus content related to the stories on the show and deep dives into how mythology and folklore can help heal the individual and the collective in the present moment and beyond. There's a link in the show notes to follow Myth is Medicine on Substack, or visit mythismedicine.substack.com. Season 5, Episode 5. Being Human is a Habit That Can Be Broken. A Story of Mannanán by Seán Pádraig O'Donoghue. Before we dive into this week's story and conversation, I wanted to be sure you know about my summer offerings. On Thursday, August 1st, we'll gather for a 3-hour retreat called Harvest, an online Lunasa retreat. Writers and creatives from around the world will gather for this event, and I hope that you'll join us. As you may know, Lunasa is the first harvest of the Celtic year. There's a rich mythology connected with this celebration. During our time together, I'll tell you the story of the goddess Taltu. It's a story about service, sacrifice, and celebration. It's a deeply important story for anyone who is seeking to do deep creative work and share it with the world. We'll work with this myth and ask it to help us reflect on our year's creative journey to that point. And because it's only the first harvest and there's so much more growing to do, we'll be setting goals and dreaming into the stories you might tell and ideas you might craft in the months to come. In this retreat, you'll have time to write and connect with a beautiful community of myth-minded folks who are on the quest to use these ancient stories to make sense of our modern world. Harvest, an online Lunasa retreat for writers and creatives, is open to everyone. Or it could be your introduction to our global writing community, the Writer's Knot. When you enroll in a 5-month membership in the Writer's Knot, from August through December of 2024, you can attend the Lunasa Writing Retreat for free. Also, one last announcement before we get into the story. If you've been wishing you could join the Writer's Knot in the past, but have never been able to make the time work, I wanted to make sure that you knew. In addition to our traditional noon Eastern on Wednesday gatherings, I'll be starting an additional group that will meet at 7 p.m. Eastern on Mondays. You can find all the details on my website, marisagowdy.com/events. And now I'd like to introduce you to this week's guest. Seán Pádraig O'Donoghue is an herbalist, poet, and teacher. He's also an initiated priest of the Fairy and Crossroads traditions. He lives in Western Maine and is the author of 3 books, The Silver Branch and the Otherworld, which is now available for pre-order, Courting the Wild Queen, and The Forest Reminds Us Who We Are. He also writes for the Plant Healer Quarterly and for his own Seán Uckle newsletter on Substack. Seán offers weekly online classes through his Otherworld Well Hedge School. As you'll hear, Seán weaves such a rich tapestry of references and allusions throughout the course of our conversation. We decided to collaborate on a Substack newsletter to offer you some further context. So please be sure that you're subscribed to both Myth is Medicine and the Seán Uckle newsletters. The link to both can be found in the show notes. I am so excited to welcome Seán back to KnotWork Storytelling for his second appearance on the podcast. As is our way here, we first ask the story to speak for itself, and then we sit together and explore all the ways it still resonates and matters. So Seán, will you tell us the story?
I will. But first, Gaurav Malgat, agus Sanya Twith. So long before the Tuatha Dé came on their black ships riding the black north wind, returning to Ireland, bringing the mysteries of the north. Long before their ancestors who left for the north were born, there was Mannanán. Mannanán, the son of the great sea of being, from which all things arise. Mannanán, whose laughter is the crashing of the waves, whose anguish and rage are the storm, whose tears become oceans. Mannanán was there. As far as we know, as far as we can say, Mannanán was always there. Though perhaps the kayak might be older than him because she remembers when the sea was a forest. And yet Mannanán himself, when he looks out upon the sea, sees a great meadow of wildflowers. So they may have come from the same time. And some say that they were sometimes lovers, and that she waited so long for his return that she turned to stone on the peninsula of Barra. It was Mannanán who taught the Tuatha Dé the ways of the ocean and the ways of the land that they returned to. It was Mannanán who, when Eithne was taken captive by her own father and sent into exile on an island tower, who carried Seán to her, that they might conceive the child who would be Lu. When Balor ordered the 3 children of Eithne to be thrown into the sea, and Lu alone survived in human form, it was Mannanán who took the other 2 children and turned them into the first seals. When Lu was in need of a foster father to teach him the old ways, it was Mannanán who fostered him, Mannanán who trained him in the arts of battle and the arts of magic, who armed him with his sword. And when the Malaysians came and brought the Tuatha Dé to defeat, and they could no longer tolerate life in a world where they could not sing to the sea and sing to the wind in the ways that they always had, it was Mannanán who gathered them at Sheath and Broga and divided among them all of the She and all of the deep lakes and all of the deep wells that they might find their dwelling places. And he sang then a great enchantment. And that great enchantment became a great mist that cloaked the departure of the Tuatha Dé as they became the Dina She, that hid them from this world. And he himself went beyond the 9th wave to the island of apples, the place where every tree bears flower and fruit at the same time, where none ever grows old, where no sorrows are known. But even then, for a time, he was not out of the reach of the people of Ireland. He would come sometimes across the waters, appearing in strange guises in the courts of kings, sometimes to chastise a foolish king, but sometimes to help a man who might become wise come into his wisdom. And so it was with Cormac MacArt. Cormac MacArt, Cormac the son of Airt, was a king who had grown up an orphan. His father, Airt, had been slain shortly after the king himself was conceived. Airt, who bore a name that echoes back into deep ancient mysteries, a name which means at once bear and stone and power and God, who walked but briefly in this world, but long enough to be the father of the son who was raised by a wolf and then fostered back into humanity and came into kingship. And in his time of kingship, a strange warrior in a cloak the color of the sea and the sky on a stormy day arrived and spoke to him. And Cormac asked this strange warrior, "From whence do you come? I've never seen your like." And he said, "I come from the land where there is no death and where there is no sorrow." And he said, "Well, it's right then that we make an alliance." And in the making of that alliance, that strange warrior placed in Cormac's hand a silver branch that bore white blossoms and bore apples of red gold, and said, "This is my gift to you. As for my share, I shall come in my time and take it." And they departed as friends. A year passed, and the warrior appeared again. And Cormac greeted him with joy. And the warrior said, "I've come to take the first of my share." And Mannanán said, "Whatever it is, I will grant it to you." And he said, "I would have your daughter." And though it grieved him, he would not break his word. And he thought this man a worthy man to wed his daughter. So he allowed the warrior to depart beyond the ninth wave, bringing his daughter with him. And all within the land wept inconsolably until Cormac raised the silver branch and shook the silver branch, and they all fell into a deep sleep and awoke, forgetting their grief. Then a little more time passed, and the man returned, and he said, "I would take the second portion of my share." Cormac said, though he was afraid, he said with trembling voice, "Take what you will." And the warrior said, "I will take your son." And again that grieved him to his core. And again he thought, "This is a noble man. If my son will serve another, let him serve this man." And he granted the request. And the people wept. And he shook again the silver branch. And they fell into a deep sleep and forgot their grief. And then in another season, the man came again. He said, "I will take the final portion of my share." And Cormac said, "You must take what I have promised you. I give to you whatever you would ask." And he said, "I would take your wife." Cormac hesitated, but he did not refuse. And the warrior took his wife. And the people mourned and wailed. And Cormac shook the silver branch, and they fell into deep sleep. But when they woke, they did not forget their grief, and nor did he. So he set off, journeying to the west, with all of his people following him. And then across their path came a great mist. And they entered into the mist, but only he emerged on the other side of the mist, alone in a strange land. But he came first upon a man who cut each day the wood of a great oak to burn for his fire. And each morning, the great oak that had been felled was replaced. And he came then upon a man who each day slaughtered a pig for his food. But the next morning, the pig was there alive again. And then he came upon a great well of glimmering waters. Ishkaya agus Ishkadorcha, dark and bright waters, shimmering like the Milky Way, shimmering like the dark of night. And over that well grew 9 hazel trees, and they dropped their nuts still within their husks into the water, where 5 salmon would bite into those hazelnuts. And the husks of those nuts would float into 5 streams that flowed out to the edge of that land and into our world as we know it. And he knelt and drank from that water. And then he continued on. And just beyond the well, he found a great house of silver. Its roof was thatched with the wings of white birds. And when he entered into the house, first was the man who had cut the oak and who had slaughtered the pig, was preparing the fire and preparing the feast. And then emerged that strange warrior and a strange, beautiful woman beside him, who stood over the cauldron while the pig was boiled. But Cormac saw that the cooking of the pig was never complete. And the warrior said, "This pig will only be cooked when 4 truths have been spoken. Each truth will bring a turning that cooks a quarter of the pig." And so the man at the fire spoke the first truth. He said, "There's a tree that I hew every morning for the wood of this fire that grows again the next day." And with that, the first turn of the spit, the first roasting of the pig. And that man spoke again a second. "This pig I slaughter every day." And the pig arises again the next day, and we are forever fed. And again, the spit turned, and the pig continued to be roasted. And then the warrior spoke his own truth. He said, "When I went out to plow the land, I found that the furrows were already dug, the seeds already sowed. When I went to reap the harvest, I found the grain was already stacked." And again, the pig turned, and the warrior turned to Cormac. And he said, "Now you must speak your truth." And Cormac said, I had a daughter, and I had a son, and I had a wife, and they were taken from me, and I have come this far to find them again. And the warrior said, this is true. And the pig was cooked. And then the feast was ready and was prepared. And the warrior bid Cormac sit down at the feast. And Cormac said, I have vowed never to eat unless 50 eat with me. And he saw then in the warrior's hand that silver branch. And the warrior shook the branch, and Cormac fell into a deep sleep. And when he woke, there was a crowd assembled, men and women of great splendor. And among them were Cormac's daughter, and Cormac's son, and Cormac's wife. And his host went to pour the mead into a cup that was cracked. And he held that cracked cup, he said, such is this cup that if 3 lies are spoken, it will shatter. But if 3 truths are spoken, it will be whole. And he said, never in her time here has your daughter seen the face of a man. Never in his time here has your son seen the face of a woman. Never in her time here has your wife known the presence of a man. And the cup became whole. And they drank together. And the warrior said, I am Mannanán, son of the great sea of being. You and your family will be forever blessed. And he sent them home, back through the mist, back across the waters, back to their land. And they lived long and happy lives, and so too did their descendants. And so it was again and again, through the generations, that Mannanán would come when his wisdom was needed, until the time of Columkill, when Columkill had a precious chalice that he had loved that became broken. And he sent a monk to bring that chalice across the water to Scotland, that it might be repaired. But upon the water, a man rose from the waves and came and held the cup and breathed into it. And the cup became whole. And so Mannanán said, take this to your Columkill and ask him what he has to say. And so the young monk returned to Columkill, bringing the chalice, which shone with greater splendor than ever. But when he was asked who had done this fine work, he spoke of the man rising from the waves. And he spoke of the man's question. And Columkill said, no honor or forgiveness is ever due to one who has not accepted Christ. And Mannanán said then, nevermore will I aid the people of Ireland until they become as weak as water. But I will say that before I knew any of these stories, I began dreaming of Mannanán. I began seeing him standing at the mouth of the Boyne and clearing the mist and opening the way for the return of those who had departed, holding the mysteries of the world. And last year at Samhain, I awoke in the morning to see the images of the great statue of Mannanán facing the sea and the light of the aurora coming from the horizon. And I believe that perhaps the time has come for him to speak with us again. And John Moriarty would say that to meet Mannanán is to become undone. To meet Mannanán is to learn that being human is a habit that can be broken. It is to hold the silver branch and to have the silver branch vision that sees the shimmering blessing of everything. And that to me is the only way forward.
Oh, Seán, thank you for taking us backward and forward and up and down and through and over, and to land us right here in this moment. Because to sit down with you, it's that sense of, I have a better understanding of what it might have been like to sit around with the bards thousands of years ago, the way you weave these stories and call all these images together in a way that gives them both new meaning and a sense of, oh, that's what that's always meant. So I just want to say first, thank you, Mila Buikas, for giving us all of this story. And again, landing us right here.
You know, and as you say that, I hear the voice actually of Sinead O'Connor. And one of the most wonderful interviews she gave was the interview she gave to Blind Boy very close to the end of her life.
Mm-hmm.
In that interview, she's speaking about when she was singing the Seán songs. And she said, you know, to sing those songs, you have to allow them to live as a ghost within you.
Mm.
And I think that's true of these stories as well. And so I'm both so honored and grateful for your words. And also, I will say that they are only possible because of what I allow to come live within me. And that's also a part of that silver branch way. And I think when Moriarty speaks of being human as a habit that can be broken, it's breaking that habit of thinking that that's all of who we are. And when we break that habit, then the multiplicity of who we are begins to flow into us again. And I know that you have Brian Walsh speaking of this so eloquently, but for me, when we have the Song of Amergin and his proclamation of the memory of all of the forms that he has known, that is that way of signaling, I've come into that memory, and having come into that memory, I can weave something different into the world. And I think about how, you know, in Irish, when we speak of fate, we say Tuatha Dé Dannan. It is in a poem. But when you go to those depths of poetry, and you think about the depths of poetry that somebody trained for 18 years in the craft would have had, when you sink deeply enough into those rhythms, into those cadences, into those words and all their many layers of meaning and association. And I love how so many words in Irish have 4 or 5 meanings that all intertwine with each other. When you sink to that, when you go to that depth, then your will and your consciousness are reshaped by that understanding of that continuing flow of dukkha's. So the way that you speak changes. And when that way that you speak changes, what you speak is woven into that poem. And so what is not in the poem can be brought into the poem when we script on nua, when we write a new poem. But you can only write that new poem if you have lived within the poem that exists.
That echoes so beautifully when you and I were speaking before we started recording, as we all do this, as people who are keepers of lore and keepers of great libraries with access to, you know, what the scribes wrote down. And you mentioned you were sort of doing that sort of cramming, the sacred cramming of saying how much 11th century monastic wisdom / knowledge can I fit into my head before I tell this story? And then you said that you remembered that you already have the story within you and that you would be guided as you told the story.
Right. Well, I'm going to cause a little bit of trouble here and say that there are those who I call the Gardi Dukas who try to police the tradition.
Yes.
And they try to police the tradition by saying, well, if it's not either in the recordings of the folklore collection, of the school's collection, so
Right.
like if it wasn't being told out loud by people in the 1940s, and it wasn't written down by monks in the 11th century, that it's not the tradition.
Right.
But the nature of a living tradition is that it's alive and forever flowing.
Yes.
And so what we have written down by 11th century monks is the way in which an 11th century person, like at that border between a Christianity that was very different from what we would call Christianity now, and older ways, was trying to make sense of everything and also write things down in a way that wouldn't get them in trouble. What we have in the folklore collection is like, yes, a survival of stories, but a survival of stories among a people just coming out of occupation, still under the heavy influence of the institution of the church, which, you know, really, the more I understand it, didn't really come to be the force that we think of it as until the wake of the Great Hunger.
Right.
And the ways in which we can look around the world, and whenever people survive genocide, very often the more fundamentalist version of religion comes forward.
Yes.
And, you know, and those themselves were survivals of the stories that the Shanachie told after the last of the Bardic colleges were destroyed in the 17th century. So, yeah, it's both continuous and not continuous, but the nature of a living tradition and the nature of an animist tradition is that it is relational and it finds its new expressions. And those expressions can often be seemingly contradictory to our modern colonized minds. I love how Rune Rasmussen in Denmark speaks about the different cosmologies, about how there are the cosmologies of distinction that seek to create a fixed map of the world. We can say where each thing is permanently located and permanently categorized, and about how those are in contrast to animist cosmologies that are always about relation. And those relationships are complex. It's like, is that man my grandfather, or is he the fire chief, or is he the house builder? It's like, yes.
Right, which is how dreams work, right? Which is how the imaginal realm truly works, because the ancestors and those who not only created the tradition, but lived the tradition, weren't doing this in order to please the religious studies departments of hallowed institutions around the globe several millennia later.
Yeah.
What you're thinking about this idea of, right now we're recording this just at the very verge of Bealtaine, you know, right, and whether it's happened or it hasn't happened, depending on how you account for time. You were describing to me how it varies for you when you sort of mark this festival of fire and fertility, depending on what's blossoming around you. And especially in our changing climate, but even year to year, when you have a deeply dark, cold winter, the hawthorn is going to blossom at a different moment. And so that changes things. And it just seems like in one of those, and of course it's contained within a cycle and it's all within a general time, but it really sort of speaks to that sense of, yes, there's an enduring tradition. And yes, there is a sense of the Sidhe lived within the hills, and that we know, we can locate them there. And yet, how many ways did the portals shift, or did Mannanán open a different door? Or do we have ways to be with these stories with the amount of fluidity that I think is so important to this culture too?
Yeah. And there are other Sidhes besides the Sidhes that we know. So there are the Sidhes within the landscape. And those are very important places. There are also she's within us. So the chest is a vast cavern, and the heart is an inner chamber within that cavern. And so the heart is a she. The womb is a place of darkness where a sudden flash of light changes everything. So the womb is a she. It's like, how is that different than she and Broga?
Mm. And just for our listeners, you're sort of playing with and being with that idea that it's not just that the she is the progenitor of the fairies. It's also that, or the, who the Tuatha Dé became in their transition. It's also that she is itself the mound. It's the dark space, right? It's
Right.
the place.
Yes.
Right.
And it's so interesting in terms of the course of the year. Billy McFlynn probably makes this case the best, that the ancient Irish year was a year of two seasons, the dark and the light. And of course, the year begins at Samhain because everything begins in darkness, just as everything begins in the darkness of the womb, and just as everything arises from the waters, and just as our world itself emerges from the infinite darkness around it.
Seán, every time we speak, I want to go in 40 different directions at once. But there's one image that I want to play with you from the story about the idea of the branch having both the blossom and the apples. And then that was also the way that it was also true of all of the trees in the land of apples that Mannanán called home.
Yeah.
There's such a sacred paradox in there. There's such abundance. What have you made of that image? I'm sure that's one that's been very rich for you.
Well, the Otherworld is always a place where time is different.
Yeah.
And so we have that showing up in so many ways. And we have that, especially, you go across the water to the story of Thomas the Rhymer and his 7 years in the Otherworld, or his 1 year, his seeming to pass in a day and a night. But when he returns to this world, the 7 years have passed. And that 7 appearing over and over again in those stories of abduction to the Otherworld. Although sometimes 9, and sometimes you get multiples and people are there for centuries. But
just math.
Right, exactly. But the math there operates differently. And it is at once, what I think of it that way, we think about, what it is dark and it is watery and it is below. And so what are the two places that we know as humans that are dark and watery and below that we dwell in? It is the womb and the tomb. And they are actually one and the same. Just as Samhain and Beltane are actually one and the same. But from the perspective of this time, of this world, they're catastrophically different. From the perspective of the Otherworld, it's just moments of shifting from a season into another season. And so the blossom and the fruit being on the tree at the same time marks that time is passing differently there than it does here. It makes me think also that we rightly spend so much time listening to and connecting with our ancestors, those of us who are trying to walk in these ways. But more and more, I've been thinking about we are also somebody else's ancestors. And if we have the courage to believe that these ways will continue, there are bonfires somewhere generations from now where people are gathered and they're telling the stories of this time and how we made it through. And so I keep saying to them, can you sing a little louder? Because we don't remember how we survived.
Pure time magic. Pure time magic. And what if that's just the way that the universe is constructed? And it's not just a dream. It's not just a vision. It's not just a fireside's tale, but it's something deep and true.
Well, it's so interesting the way we have that showing up, where it's like modern minds, when we look back at the old text, try to say, okay, like here are 5 figures with the same name who each seem to be a different person.
Mm,
What's their relationship to each other?
right.
It's like, well, maybe they're all the same being, just appearing in different iterations in the
Right.
same moment. And maybe
Yes.
we are too. And I love how, in Connemara, I'm told it's common not to say Seán is anam dum, but rather Seán atá orm. So you
Huh.
speak of one's name as being upon you. In the same way
Right.
you would speak of an emotion or a state being upon you. And
Right.
so it's just another garment. But
Oh,
when you
that's
put on
beautiful.
the cloak of this name, you
Right.
take on these aspects.
And that calls to the part of the story when you gave us. So Cormac's father is Art. And those who've listened to earlier in the season, they heard Karina Tynan's story about Achton, who and she and Art were together for one day, and then Cormac was born. But you reminded me or gave me that gift of, because I knew Art had an association with bear, as you mentioned, but it also has bear, stone, power, and God. And what that reveals, perhaps about one character, but about the way that a people would see these interconnections that for us, if you kind of squint your eyes and look sideways and let your imagination go and maybe allow yourself to write a poem or two about it, you start to see that all those words can and do and want to inform each other. And you learn so much in the being with those different resonances.
And it's so interesting when we look at it from an archaeological perspective, because like the last bears in Ireland, I don't know whether it was the late Paleolithic or the early Neolithic, and we know there were people and bears present at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
because there are carved bear bones found in Clare
Mm-hmm.
that are among the oldest relics in Ireland. However, not only were those people not the direct ancestors of the Irish people, they were not even the direct ancestors of the Anatolian people who came to Ireland in the Neolithic and built the great monuments. And so this is deep, deep history. But yet there's a memory of a bear was important and a bear was sacred.
Right.
And we can look actually all across the Northern Hemisphere and find that one of the oldest ways of worship was the placing of the bear skull in the cave. And so when you then get to the medieval period in Ireland, and you have a word that can be glossed simultaneously as bear and stone and God and power, you think there's some sort of echo. And like, was this because people found carved bear bones in caves? Was this just some sort of memory that arose from the land itself? And so again, we have the guardians of the tradition today who want to say, well, you can't claim anything as being from the ancient past if you can't directly trace how it passed. But that's not how things have ever worked. And these mysteries are where the truth lies.
And you're saying that there was a phrase you used earlier, catastrophically different. And I wish I had the exact moment from when you used that phrase. Of course, as our conversations loop and bend, we are doing the Celtic KnotWork conversation style as we do. But that just seems that I wrote that phrase down as you said it, as just sort of that misunderstanding of our time. Of that, I think you were speaking about the sense of the womb and the tomb, and we see those as catastrophically different in our modern minds. And you were giving us that idea of the blossom and the fruit being able to live together. And we're kind of drawing these lines between this sense of when we have those cultural police officers, and then when we have those who are trying to say, yes, and we need to be rooted into all of the knowledge we have and what's our lived tradition? What is our intuited understanding of what might have and what did come before? And then of course, here we are in a moment in history when differences feel catastrophic, and we're living the pain of that moment right now. We're living the pain of those differences. Because one thing that I just so love in talking to you is you have this immense breadth and depth of ancient knowledge. But I know that you are also so attuned to what's happening in the world as a whole right now. You're not hiding out in the cave with the bear, and you're not just out with the plants. You're also so deeply engaged with the world. And I just want to sort of just appreciate that, but just to be with that moment of saying, thank you for showing us that these catastrophic differences, there's another way to look at them, but also to be with the pain that sort of separation causes.
Yeah. Well, and of course, speaking of that, Palestine is with us, and the deep, deep connections between Ireland and Palestine as nations that understand colonization. And just yesterday, I was coming across the wonderful living Palestinian poet, Mossab Abu Toha, whose work I look to every day as he is speaking truths from Gaza, speaking about his beloved mentor, Rafat al-Arir, who was assassinated in autumn. And he was sharing, I wish I could remember the exact words, but he was sharing a quote from Rafat al-Arir, who spoke of how sometimes a homeland becomes a story, and then that story becomes a homeland. And I thought about that. I said, oh, well, that's the Dinchanicus.
Right. Yes.
And I think about that also when I think about this time of the year, and we're also at that same, it's also like a marking in the old stories of a time in history.
Mm.
And so, Beltana was the time that the Tuatha Dé Dannan arrived on the ships riding the north wind. We know that because when their ships landed, the hawthorn bloomed at Ishnach. It was also the time that the Malaysians came over the sea, and when they landed. And we know that because when American spoke the last verses of his poem, the hawthorn bloomed at Ishnach. We were speaking before we came on about my sudden realization that while I think of Easter Monday as being far from Beltana, that actually in 1916, Easter Monday was April 26th. And so in many ways, we can think of the proclamation as the conjuring in of another world, another layer of time, which is only now, coming fully into fruition. I feel like it's so interesting when we look at the proclamation of the Irish Republic. As far as I know, it's the first foundational document of a modern state that recognizes the equality of women. But of course, it's just in the past decade that that's come into reality within Ireland, and more emergence of women's voices, along with a resurgence of the language and a remembering and renaming of the land by its old names and a reweaving of those old stories. And of course, one of the stories that we have yet to complete is we can look to the north. And if we look to the north from a mythic standpoint, we can say, oh yes, the men of Ulster dishonored Macha, and she brought the curse that in their moment of greatest need, they would feel the pain of a woman in childbirth. And so it was. And, we can look to the horrific pain of the hunger strikers in Long Kesh as, in many ways, an iteration of that pain. But what we have now, we have the men have given leadership over to the women, with Michelle O'Neill in the north and Mary Lou McDonald in the south, in the leadership of Sinn Féin, seeming to be likely, hopefully, I see it in the poem, the ones who will preside over the reunification of Ireland, and who are also holding that memory of what the people have been through, have been able to speak the story of the Palestinians in such a powerful way. And also the story of the immigrants, because there is such a rise of hostility against migrants in Ireland right now as a result of the housing crisis. And to Sinn Féin's credit, they are pointing to the vulture funds and the landlords and saying, these migrants are not the reason you don't have housing. You have a common enemy. And it circles back around to Mannanán, because I think about how Mannanán so often appears as the stranger, and whether the stranger is greeted with hospitality or whether the stranger is treated rudely depends on what's the nature of the trickster magic that Mannanán brings in response.
And that he was, I mean, I find it fascinating that in our beautiful meandering conversation, Mannanán hasn't come through all that many times. And yet I feel like he's been holding us all the way through this. And as the trickster does, sort of dancing in and out and saying, oh, I don't necessarily have to be the star of this particular narrative or even of this particular conversation to be holding this and be darting in and out of it. And then as you just, sort of to end where we began with Moriarty, and I'm just so grateful you brought him into the conversation immediately. And that idea, I think a lot about that phrase about our connection to the more than human world. But in the way that you describe it and the way that Moriarty works, it's remembering it's not just, yes, it's about the mycelium and our plant allies and our animal companions, but it's also the entire spiritual other world that is Mannanán's realm that we are invited to see, to co-conspire with, to be with, and to allow to infiltrate us.
It's so interesting, Celtic twilight and the nature of twilight. So twilight being that liminal time.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting that among the stories of the Celtic twilight, you find Mannanán in Lady Gregory's writing. Yes. And you find him in a few other places, but he generally was not as much a part of those stories.
Did you read much of Eva Gore Booth's work?
No, I haven't.
She did some brilliant Mannanán work that I've been thinking of the whole time during our conversation.
I'll have to delve into that.
I've got you. I have some photocopies from the olden days. If I need to send them to you, I will.
But it's so interesting. And I find that people love to criticize the Celtic twilight for what it left out.
Right.
But we can also look at, well, what was the purpose of that movement? The purpose of that movement was to take people who had been denied an identity and reconstruct a national identity with these remnants of old stories. But that reconstruction really centered the stories of the warriors who were the champions of the people. It was the stories of warfare that were brought to the forefront. And there was reason and there was necessity for that. And there was also reason for centering that idea of identity. But that idea of identity was also a colonial idea. It's like this idea of the distinct individual and of the distinct nation really arise out of the rise of capitalism. And so, yes, that's a stage that needed to be passed through. And I think we need to honor all of those who did that and honor the fact that we wouldn't be telling these stories today if many somebodies hadn't helped to try to bring them back alive. But I go to what Moriarty says about meeting Mannanán, and I think that this is perhaps part of the reason that that Mannanán was not so embraced within the Celtic twilight is, Moriarty says, that to meet Mannanán is to learn that being human is a habit that can be broken. And breaking that habit of being human is breaking that habit of identity and breaking. It's like, yeah, we had to recover identity to a degree, but in order to pass into what comes next, we need to let go of it. And we need to come into that place of remembering our multiplicities. And so he ushers us into that.
Seán, what a perfect place to land our conversation. Thank you so much for bringing your stories and your reflections. It's just the richness and multiplicities of all that you have to offer. I feel like we could be talking for days. Clearly, we'll have to have you back on again soon.
Yes, please.
A beautiful way for people to continue their journey with you is your book that's going to be coming out soon, right?
Yes, which appropriately enough is titled The Silver Branch and the Otherworld. It's going to be released on my birthday, July 16th of this summer, which is also the birthday of my great-grandfather, Donald O'Donoghue, whose story we spoke of in an earlier season. And that book is available for pre-order if you're hearing this before July through my publisher, Inner Traditions.
I have had the great fortune of seeing an advanced copy, and it is brilliant. And I'm so looking forward to being able to hold a paper copy in my hand, and really there's going to be much underlining and much savoring and reading it under my favorite tree, I hope. So.
Yeah, good.
Mm-hmm. Well, Seán, is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with as we say farewell today?
Just I'll repeat for the third time Moriarty's words. Yes. Being human is a habit that can be broken. And so let yourself break that habit and come back to it. He speaks also of the importance of when you've been too long a seal at sea, when you've been too long a hawk above the cliff, then you feel the yearning to come back into humanity. You come back into humanity different, having remembered how to be outside that habit and having made that human nature into a garment that you can slip in and out of. And so that Mannanán help you break that habit of being human.
Thank you so much, Seán. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the KnotWork Storytelling Podcast. Please subscribe and review the show on your favorite podcast platform, and do share this episode with other lovers of myth and story. By the way, everyone is a lover of myth and story, even if they've forgotten. Creating this show is a labor of love, and your support will help me continue to craft and share stories through this season and beyond. Please consider becoming a subscriber to my paid newsletter, Myth is Medicine. You'll find it on Substack, and that's where all my newest writing and occasional bonus podcasts can be found. You can learn more about my writing, my book, our online creative community, The Writer's Knot, as well as how to work with me as a writing coach over at marisagowdy.com. Gratefully, I live, write, work, and record this podcast on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape tribe, whose name means original people.